share some research we've been doing. We started this last summer, and so it's been really exciting to get it to a useful form this quickly. And certainly this hasn't been something I've done alone. We have quite an extensive ketosis team at UW that we've been building up and working through this work. So Kent Weigel, many of you know, geneticist and chair there, Gary Essel in the vet school, Randy Shaver, nutrition extension specialist, and Robert Fordrain at Axsource has really been involved as a collaborator on this. And then we've had a couple grad students that are, of course, the ones that are getting the work done. So as we talk about the transition cow, how she's a metabolic case study, I don't have to tell you guys that this is the cow we have to pay the most attention to on the farm. She's often the one causing or having challenges. And that's because of this energy demand at the onset of lactation. So as she's dry and approaches calving, her feed intake, here in yellow, energy consumed, exceeds the requirement, the blue line, and that leaves her in positive energy balance. However, at the onset of calving and the onset of lactation, we know that she goes into a state of a sharp increase in energy and glucose requirement. What she's consuming in her feed is very short to follow and cannot keep up with that requirement, and thus she enters negative energy balance. And this is in terms of energy and glucose demands of lactation, and this insufficient energy and glucose intake presents a huge demand and challenge on the liver of the dairy cow. And so she has to find a way to make up the difference in energy and glucose, and she does that, of course, by mobilizing body fat or milking off her back. And so the mobilized fat will be entered into the bloodstream as non-esterified fatty acids. Now remember, that fat was as a triglyceride in the adipose store, so we really get two components here. The glycerol backbone of that triglyceride goes to the liver and can be used to make glucose through gluconeogenesis. And that glucose then goes to the mammary tissue to make lactose and supports milk production. The fatty acids can support milk fat production, but perhaps most importantly, post-calving, those fatty acids are broken down into the acetyl-CoA building blocks in the liver. And that acetyl-CoA can be completely oxidized to energy. However, we know there's a capacity for how much of that can happen. And when that capacity is reached and exceeded, there has to be alternative metabolism of acetyl-CoA, and that's ketogenesis to ketone bodies, which when exacerbated can become ketosis, or reesterification into lipids, which are stored in the liver tissue itself, and we get fatty liver or liver lipid accumulation. So in transition dairy cows, we know that ketosis affects 40 to 60% of those animals, and that the average case costs almost $300. So this certainly is a problem that warrants looking at and working on improving management of. So when we say ketosis, we're talking about hyperketonemia, anytime blood ketones are greater than 1.2 millimolar. Historically, we have broken this out into clinical and subclinical ketosis, clinical being BHBA greater than 3.0, which are those cases where we usually have observable symptoms. So there's something about that cow that we can see that tells us she has ketosis. We've done a really good job of managing this, and incidence of clinical ketosis is somewhere between 10 to 15% of dairy cows in the U.S. Subclinical ketosis are cows with a blood BHBA between 1.2 and 2.9. Again, 40 to 60% of our cows fall into this range. And this has been coined a silent killer because there's no clear and obvious sign that this cow is sick, yet we know that there are negative outcomes. She won't reach her potential milk production, and then there's also risk for comorbidity. So we know that this cow is costing us money. Both cases can be diagnosed by quantifying DHBA or acetone in milk, urine, or blood. And it can be primary or secondary, meaning that ketosis can be the initial insult that causes the further problems, or it can be a result of another initial insult like dystocia or metritis or mastitis. So before we move on, I want to make sure that we're quantifying ketosis across the farms with the same words. Incidence is how we refer to the total number of new cases at any point in time. So in our diagram here of 7 cows, we would have to do repeat sampling on each of these cows to definitively say if she ever developed ketosis. And we may identify these 3 cows. Okay? Prevalence is how many cases are present on any one day. Most of the time when we're on farm, this is what we have because this is much more realistic for us. It involves going out and spot sampling, so on one day you go test 7 cows, and maybe you only find this 1 cow positive that day. So we know that the relationship between the two is that a multiplier of about 2 to 2.5 times prevalence gives us incidence. And so when we're talking about this, we go out to farm, usually we get prevalence. A lot of times our thresholds are established based on what our goal incidence would be. So why do we need to detect ketosis? What's so wrong with a cow that has ketosis? A lot of our updated or more current information on this is from a large collaborative study out of Cornell and UW-Madison, where they looked at a couple thousand cows on commercial dairies, and they did that repeat time point sampling. So they tested 6 times to definitively say if she was positive or negative. And when they compared all of the cows that were greater than 1.2, so this is clinical or subclinical, to healthy cows, those cows that had a 1.2 or greater had increased risk of displaced abomasum, had decreased milk production, increased risk of culling in the first 30 days, and decreased reproductive performance. So there are clear negative outcomes of ketosis. Now one might also ask, well, maybe I could just wait till she's clinical or not test as often and catch her later. What's the harm in doing that versus treating them as soon as possible? So in this study, they had enough animals, they were able to sort out just that. And they compared cows that were at 2.4 millimolar, so halfway in that subclinical range, to cows that were at 1.2 millimolar, just at the cutoff. And what they found is that this 2.4 millimolar cow compared to the 1.2, so this is not compared to a healthy cow, this is compared to another sick cow, was 3 times more likely to develop a displaced abomasum, 50 times more likely to be culled within the first 30 days, less likely to conceive at first service, and produced 180 kilograms less milk in the first 30 days, and then over the whole lactation had a decreased milk production. So certainly some negative outcomes that we can't afford to be losing for a lack of detection. This can be managed though. Early detection and treatments are key in reducing those negative outcomes. So I said earlier, each case of hyperketonemia is costing us about $290. It's $256 for first calf heifers, $375 for cows. The big difference being there, of course, the difference in milk production we would expect from those older animals, right? If we break this down, about 40% of it is due to the component cost of ketosis itself. Okay? About a third of it is due to increased likelihood to develop metritis. And about a quarter of it is due to the cost of DA, so those cows that progress on and have develop a DA and need correction for that. So let's extrapolate that through an example. If we think about a farm with 1,000 calvings per year and 30% incidence, so these are all cases identified, we would have had to do repeat sampling here, that farm would lose $90,000 a year due to ketosis. Okay? Now, if we could do something that reduced incidence to 15%, so cut incidence in half, it would save us $50,000 a year, and that's based on how much of this expense we know we can recover by detecting and treating. Okay? Another way to look at that is, well, how are you going to cut incidence in half? Usually you have to do something, right? So if we had to make a $50,000 investment on that farm to improve transition cow management or dry cow housing, fresh cow comfort, any of those things, but it resulted in a reduction in incidence by half, then we would recover that cost within 1 year. Okay? So certainly some margin for improvement and some margin for benefit on farm. So how do we do those? How do we reduce incidence? Transition cow management is certainly at the top of that list, monitoring fresh cows and treating other comorbidities. But we've found that a key in this is ketosis monitoring, so determining prevalence on farm, catching early cases, and treating those cases. All right, so what are the tools available to us on that? Blood is the most accurate, we've found through research, but there are challenges. Who has used a precision extra meter on farm, or maybe another meter? All right, so what do we have? It's labor intensive, right? You've got to be out there. It's recommended that every fresh cow be tested twice. whether you're doing twice weekly testing on those early fresh cows or once a week testing later, or for a longer period, sorry. But also, the strips are expensive, and who is having trouble getting them right now? So that's another frustration. I get a lot of phone calls about that. Where do I get strips? And right now there's a lag that's adding to the difficulty for use of that. Has anyone tried these Nova meters, either Nova Max or Nova Vet? One person in the back. Okay. How do you like them?
Good.
Good? So we've been looking at those because I've been getting a lot of calls and questions a couple of weeks about them. The Nova Max seems like it would be, did you use Nova Max or Nova Vet?
Nova Max.
Nova Max, yep. Nova Max is quite a bit cheaper than Nova Vet, even though Vet is actually designed for livestock. We've been looking at it, and so far it looks like the Nova Max could be a pretty close contender. Nova Vet's not quite as accurate for us, so if you need a tool, that might be one out there for you. All right, well, those are very intensive protocols. So what can we do to monitor this on the herd level? The thing that we've used historically has been milk fat to protein. Who's used that ratio to indicate ketosis when you walk out and do a spot check on a farm? We've all used that at least to some degree, right? But what we know is that if we correlate milk fat to protein ratio with blood VHBA, it's not a very strong relationship there. So an R-squared of 0.22 doesn't get me too excited. It's suggestive, but alone is not a strong predictor. We're not going to make management decisions based on that alone. And so when I was here last year, one of the things I was just starting to work on was a new approach to doing this, a new tool. And what we had available to us that was not available previously was equipment through FOSS, which does the inline milk testing during monthly milk testing. This is based on infrared spectrophotometry, and they're able to now quantify milk VHBA and acetone in addition to protein, fat, somatic cell, all the things you're used to getting. And so I thought, well, this surely would add to our toolbox and give us a new tool or a new advantage. And so I took some samples that I had that we had been collecting, and I sorted cows into healthy in the gray bars or black ketosis here, based on their blood VHBA that I had already collected. Okay? And then I looked at their milk VHBA on the left, and their milk VHBA was greater in the ketotic cows than the healthy cows. That was good. If it was the other way around, I would have run screaming. Milk acetone, the same thing. Ketotic cows had greater milk acetone than healthy cows. Now, some groups in Europe and Canada had said that we should be able to put a straight cutoff on this, much like we do with blood VHBA. And so I applied their cutoffs. Unfortunately, when I did that for milk VHBA, my healthy cows were sick, and according to the acetone, my sick cows were healthy. So for whatever reasons, this didn't apply to our U.S. cows and may not apply to other cows, as we're finding out now. And so I really wanted to set out to make a better tool. How do we develop something that can be used to indicate ketosis on a herd level that's a little more practical and efficient for us as nutritionists and consultants, but also for the producer? And that's where this research project came out of. We collected blood samples on the day of milk test. So this was working with AgSource. Farms invited us out. We had 550 cows and heifers in the original data set. This has grown into the thousands now. Across 10 Holstein farms, Jerseys we're working on separately. And so we had these cows, and we had on the day of milk test their first milk test, and then a blood sample. And we used that blood sample to do a laboratory VHBA. That's really the gold standard versus using precision extrameter, which we know has some error associated with it. And we had their dairy comp data that's exported as a normal part of milk testing, and then we also had that complete milk analysis. And so then we set out to do the statistics and to model this every way that we could possibly dream up, and I had a master's student who had baptism by fire on statistics. And she learned more about modeling in that month than I think she has in a year and a half of statistics classes since then. But we modeled that, and I'll show you one example here in the next slide. But we really ran those models through to look for accuracy, first off. So our overall ability to predict prevalence compared to what we found it was that day based on the blood values. And then also the strength of the model. We heard from Jeffrey Bewley this morning that there's sensitivity and specificity, right? So we want to avoid false negatives and also avoid false positives. And I have a lot of people who say, well, make the model as sensitive as possible. I want to catch every sick cow I can. I don't. I do not want to send a producer a report that says they have 70% ketosis and they're out blood testing cows that were not sick. So to us, this is the art of, or the science of balancing the sensitivity and the specificity to result in a model that's as accurate as possible to be used as a tool. So this is what one of the models, just an example here, looks like. On the x-axis, we have the predicted BHBA, and then on the y-axis, the actual the actual blood BHBA. And you can see it's a pretty tight correlation there, and we're able to predict it pretty strongly using multiple variables that come out of the milk and the cow data. And so very early on, we saw that some of these cows could be modeled differently. Given the etiology of ketosis, this didn't surprise us. We know that the disease is a little bit different in first calf heifers than in cows. And so we pulled those two groups of animals out right away. We also know that the disease is most likely to onset between 5 and 9 or 10 days of milk. Right? And so we split out that first full week a cow was eligible for milk test, 5 to 11 days of milk. And we modeled that separately than the later 12 to 20 days of milk range. And that strengthened both sets of models, honing that model in specifically for each subgroup. And so these are the 4 models that result for Holsteins. These are the R-squareds. They're actually getting a little stronger now, but as strong as 0.75. The weakest one almost 0.6. And the overall accuracy of those models is between about 83% to 87%. And usually we want something that's about 90% sensitive, 90% accurate. So that was very exciting for us, and we were pleasantly surprised with the strength of the models. All right, so how do we use this on farm? What do we want you to take out of this? How do we want it to benefit? The first thing is that we need an indicator of herd prevalence. A lot of times we make a recommendation to do blood testing if your prevalence is above 15%, right? Well, how in the heck do we know if the prevalence was above 15% to start with? We have to go out and do blood testing. And so one of the first ways that I think this is a benefit on farm is that it gives you an indicator of prevalence on a monthly basis. And you can use that to make those next step decisions if you need to be out there doing blood testing, if you need to update your transition cow protocols. So these were the first 10 farms that participated, and you could see if our goal is 10%, some were right at or even below that, but some were very high. But what we also noted is that this farm here that's right at the cutoff was that's right at about 11% prevalent. 2 weeks before, we were at that farm for a teaching purpose, and they had 40% prevalence that day. And I think that highlights what this next slide shows is that prevalence is variable within the same farm over time. And we know that anecdotally, and I think this really highlights that this was one of the farms that we worked with. They had been testing every other week 30 fresh cows with the blood meter. And they shared their data with us. We plotted it out, so you could see a lot of variation. So if we said you should be blood testing because you're over the 15%, there's a lot of months that was probably justified, right? But there were also a lot of months they could have been using their time and money doing something different on farm, and that would have been okay. So prevalence on each farm is dynamic. All right, so if we take all of that into consideration, the KetoMonitor can assess relative prevalence. It gives us a prevalence compared to the target, okay? That 10% goal we all keep in mind. We can monitor the impact of changes implemented, whether those are intentional or unintentional. So maybe you had to open a silage bag a little earlier than you would have liked. What impact did that have? If your herdsman changed or someone was out, it can help identify those changes and the impact of them. It can monitor shifts in on-farm prevalence, like I showed in the last diagram. But then also it can monitor shifts that have a regional impact. How many times do we get a call from a farm and they say, oh, my prevalence just jumped from 15% to 40%. Okay, well, start looking at individual farm factors, right? But what if you get 3 or 4 calls later that week where that happened to other farms at the same time? Then maybe it's something that's a little broader, like weather, heat stress, or et cetera. So that could be a potential thing that helps us reduce frustration or identify what's causing a change in prevalence. So overall, it provides a tool to guide nutritional and management decisions. So let's work through an example here. This is data that I put together, but it's designed to mimic that figure I just showed you. So 12 months of prevalence on a farm, and we'll go with that 1,000 calvings a year that we used earlier. In this case, when we start at 30% prevalence, it certainly justifies doing blood detection or some slightly more intensive management than maybe the farm was doing before. But as we get down to 10%, maybe that is no longer justified due to the expense of testing and labor. But if we stop testing there, eventually we may have something that triggers an increase, and this may alert us to needing to do blood testing again for a few months. Okay? The problem is how do we know that number every month if we're not out there doing blood testing? And if we do blood testing and we find this 5%, that may give us a false sense of comfort. We may stop doing that and miss this increase here because we've stopped doing blood testing. And so if we want to do blood testing on that farm, just to add some cost to this, 2 times for each fresh cow would be about $500 a month. This was before the price of the strip skyrocketed, so a little bit of an underestimation now, $6,000. If we did milk testing with the KetoMonitor every month, that would be about $100, and then every month we would get this number. So once a month when you did your testing, you'd get this value. And the benefit of that being that $1,200 investment tells you when you need to go in and do something a little more intensive. So it highlights those months that you need to go in and do blood testing, and highlights months that you don't have to. You could spend that time and money doing something else. So if we add up the new expenses of each of those, then we have $3,200 a year. So we've reduced cost to half, and then we've reduced our time to a third, because now our herdsman can be doing something else, or our manager can be doing something else. But we're not missing those cases. All right, so going back to our example of how to reduce costs, the KetoMonitor's role is that it can reduce unnecessary blood testing, saving time and money. It can aid farms that don't have the labor or the consistency to blood test. We've all been on these farms. We'd love to have that data, but for whatever reason, labor shortages, consistency, we just can't get the data. It can guide nutritional and management decisions on the farm, and again, it can flag the impact of implemented transition cow changes, whether we did those on purpose or not, and whether they had a positive or a negative impact. So what does this look like? Has anyone seen a KetoMonitor report from one of the farms they're working with? Okay, so a couple people have. This is what it looks like on the first page. I'm going to zoom in here right away. In the top panel, there's overall the whole 5 to 20 days. So this is prevalence for first lactation animals, and then the older animals, and then over all of the lactation. Gives you the predicted prevalence here, and then the targets that we shoot for, less than 5% in the heifers, less than 15% in the cows, getting us to that 10% goal on farm. It also breaks out the early fresh 5 to 11 day in milk window. Remember, that's when they're most likely to have onset. Now this is a single time point test. So if a cow is in the 5 to 20 day in milk range, but not the bottom one, so say she was 18 days on the day of milk test, okay? That doesn't mean that she hasn't been sick since 9 days in milk, right? It just means that we didn't test milk on that day, and the day we tested milk, she was 18 days in milk. So it's important to keep in mind that this is single time point testing. Then those values are shown graphically here on the right graph. That's overall ketosis prevalence. And then for the 5 to 11 day in milk range here on the bottom. And we can show a year's worth of data there. And I think that's important to helping a farm look for patterns over time that may be contributing to higher than desired prevalence. On the back, we have a list of cows that were predicted positive, that early range in the gray, and then the later in the white. And you know, when we went into this, we were very adamant that this was a herd level tool, and that we didn't want to identify individual cows. I didn't think that the models would be strong enough to do that. I didn't have that confidence. But when the models came out and they were in the 90s, high 90s for accuracy, I can't not give a producer a list and say, hey, if you haven't looked at these cows, you need to go do that. There will be some false positives on the list. I tell them that right up front. But what I found is that when I'm talking to a farm and they look down this list in their dairy comp, they say, oh, she was cold, oh, she was sick, we had to treat her 3 times, oh, she died, she called, oh, I didn't see this cow, but she's not making nearly as much milk as I thought she should. So this list does seem to be very helpful to them. The other thing is that you can look down this list and find patterns. One of the farms I was at a few weeks ago, their target was 50 days dry, and every cow on the predicted list had a days dry greater than 80 days. So he said, okay, any cow that has a longer than desired dry period gets blood tested. and that works for them. That gives them a tool. So guiding management and nutritional decisions. All right, so what have we learned so far? I love data. That's probably why I'm in research, right? So I get really excited about data. We've run this on about 90,000 fresh cows so far since we launched it in January, which gives me a lot of data, which makes me very happy, and my grad students very overworked with statistics. Overall, the herd prevalence has been right around 19%. Heifers, 7%. We're doing pretty well with the heifer prevalence. But the cows, we've got 27% prevalence in the older animals. So certainly a margin for improvement there, a chance and opportunity to make a difference. All right, so what did we find if we look at negative outcomes? We talked about some of those in the beginning. This is negative prediction for ketosis by KetoMonitor, how many fresh cows we have in that set so far, and then 30-day culling rate. So cows predicted positive had a 4.5% 30-day culling rate, compared to those detected or predicted as negative, 1.4. So 3 times more likely to be culled if they were predicted positive. So that same negative outcome holds true when we extrapolate it across all of these commercial farms. Now we're getting far enough that we can look at some other negative outcomes. This is milk production. So average peak milk, okay, so this is by milk test. If the cow had a KetoMonitor in her first milk test, then once she's past her peak, we put her into this data set. And you can see that in the heifers, the positive, predicted positive animals are making 4 pounds less a day at peak, so that we know is going to extrapolate out. And for the second or greater lactations, that's about a 3-pound disadvantage to those predicted positives. So certainly negative impact on milk production as well. We're looking at this, and we're also looking at reproduction, days open, and rebreeding now that we're getting far enough out in the data set. So perhaps the most exciting thing that we've learned so far is that farms are really being able to use this. This was just shared with me this week. An AgSource field representative, this is one of her farms that had 1,200 cows. They were gracious enough to let me use it. She went out to the farm and had just these first 4 months of data and said, okay, you know, maybe a problem. Have you been testing? Have you been looking at ketosis? They said, no, we really want to. We just don't have the labor to do it. And they said, but wow, that's really high. That's 40% prevalence. We're going to do something about it. And so they made 2 changes at once, right? The fatal error, so now they don't know which one did it. But within a month, reduced the prevalence of ketosis to at the goal, and then steadily declining after that. So this is a farm that was able to use this data, make a change, and that's really exciting for me, is that it's being used and implemented on farm. All right, so overall, ketosis is a costly but manageable disease. KetoMonitor is a new approach that gives us a herd-level prevalence monitoring system. So it gives us something to get us an answer every month without doing that intensive blood testing. It can be used in conjunction with blood testing when prevalence is higher than desired, or to hone in on what the problem may be. Provides an economical option for farms that don't always need to do blood testing. When they're low in prevalence, they can take those months off of that, or don't have the labor to do the blood testing. And it can assist in reducing the negative outcomes and helping recover some of that potential lost profit. So with that, I'd be happy to take any questions. Yes?
How many herds in data set are Jerseys?
That's a very good question. So at the beginning, I threw up that 2 farms. And so what we found, we went to 2 Jersey farms. We found that Jerseys need to be modeled separately. No surprise, given the difference in components in ketosis etiology. And so what we did, instead of putting them all together and making the models weaker, we actually set out to do an additional research project. We've just finished that one up. We now have 8 Jersey farms, 370 Jersey cows in that data set so far. And those are actually modeling even stronger. So the accuracy of those are all in the 90s. R-squareds in the 0.8 or above. So that'll be hopefully available pretty soon. I do want to cross-validate the data set first. But, yeah. Do you work with a lot of Jersey farms?
Yep.
Yeah. So we definitely wanted the tool to be available to them as well. Yeah.
Brown Swiss compared to Holstein?
Haven't looked at it, sorry. Can't say. What I know is that the Brown Swiss etiologically, so that was the short answer. The Brown Swiss etiologically act more like Jerseys. And so that may fit in with the Jersey model a little better. Good question. other questions?